I think in order to save women, we will have to abandon feminism.
For the
That's what I
record,
said.
for the record,
In
for the record, I'm listening to a video essay. I do not subscribe to any of the views expressed in any videos.
order to save women, I think we're going to have to
Nah, I just peeped. That's a crazy line to fucking start off a video.
abandon feminism. And I think I'm right.
So why would Julie Bindel, professed feminist, be defending Kelly J. Keane by falsely giving the impression that she's a feminist? The second confusing thing here is that only a few years ago, Julie Bindel was a harsh critic of Keane. She stated that she despises Keane's politics and tactics, that she's motivated by narcissism, bigotry and ego, her allying with the Christian right is a disaster, and so on. So that's the second thing I want to talk about today. Julie Bindel was previously very critical of Keane's political tactics, but today she's defending her. And Julie Bindel isn't alone in this. Previously relegated to the outskirts of the movement because of her perceived bigotry and extremism, Kelly J. Keane has been increasingly welcomed into the mainstream of so-called gender-critical feminism. Just recently, Helen Joyce wrote an article about Keane praising her quote genius, which was shared on Twitter by J.K. Rowling. Rowling also wrote in support of the Let Women Speak event in Melbourne, criticising how the event and Keane were portrayed afterwards in the media. Also, at the suggestion that Keane could take legal action against the media, someone pointed out to Rowling the expense of taking legal action, to which Rowling replied that she's already offered to pay Kelly J. Keane's legal fees. So, this is my second question anyway. Why is the mainstream now welcoming Keane when previously they had shunned her? And there's a third question I'm interested in today. Regardless of whether they'd be let in, why would the neo-Nazi group want to show up to a Let Women Speak event in the first place? As anyone who pays attention to Keane's events will know, the Australian National Socialist movement turning up at the Melbourne event is not a one-off. Members of far-right groups turning up and even getting to speak at Keane's events is a regular occurrence. So, why are they coming? Are they just taking any opportunity for attention and a platform, or is there something about Kelly J. Keane and her movement that the far-right groups actually want to support? If you look at the history of Let Women Speak, you'll see a pattern emerge. Keane will organise an event, far-right groups or speakers will attend. See Hearts of Oak turning up to her events in the UK. Her event in Miami had a speaker who's a member of the Proud Boys. This group of far-right activists turned up to her rally in New Zealand, so on and so forth. As a result of these sorts of associations, in addition to Keane's online associations with white nationalists, Keane will be asked, often by women who agree with her otherwise, to please distance herself and her movement from those far-right groups, and please stop opening the door for fascists because it's making us all look terrible. And then Keane will say in response,
Whoever's ostracising everyone, they need to get a grip. That's all there is to it. I'm not remotely interested in the silly, frivolous, ridiculous, schoolgirl, catty behaviour of women. I don't care if you call me a feminist. I don't care if you call me a Nazi. I don't care if you call me right wing. I don't care if you call me a white supremacist. I don't care if you call me racist. I don't care if you're about religious. I don't care if you're an atheist. I don't care if you worship Satan himself. I don't care. I would absolutely literally take the hand of the devil himself. I will align with whoever I damn well please. I will stand next to the devil himself. I've said this before. I will stand beside the devil himself.
You can feel Keane's frustration as she repeatedly has to restate that she will absolutely team up with anyone. And every time she's met by skeptical women saying, well, surely by anyone you don't actually mean anyone, and Keane has to again say, no, anyone, the devil himself. And Kelly J. Keane has a message for those women who keep questioning her tactics.
And if women aren't doing it directly, they're not doing it directly, they're strangling us in other ways. They're trying to silence us, not quite the right message, not working with the right people, not talking to the right people. Each and every one of you women who stand in my way, each and every one of you, let me just tell you, you will be annihilated. Because I genuinely don't lose.
So, what single issue could possibly be so important as to justify teaming up with the devil himself and annihilating all who stand in your way? Well, Posey Parker, Kelly J. Keane, is opposed to trans rights. She is a transphobe. Now, let me hit pause here for a second. I called her a transphobe because she herself says she is a transphobe and is happy to be labelled a transphobe.
Everything is transphobic nowadays, which is why I'm happy to be called a transphobe. And in the fullness of time, I will be proven right, because I always am.
Fuck you, kill yourself.
There is precious little I'm not right about. Ever. Precious, precious little that I am not right about, and there is absolutely nothing that I lose.
I have to make this clear here, because if you call someone a transphobe, you can get bogged down in debates about what transphobia is, usually with people who would never admit anything was transphobic, even someone outright saying something like, I hope trans people die. So just to cut that off right here, that was Kelly J. Keane herself saying she's happy to be labelled a transphobe, so me and her are in complete agreement there. So, okay. Keane is a transphobe. But that obviously means something different for me than it does for her, right? For me, it means that she hates trans people and opposes trans rights, but what does it mean for her?
Really, look, I'm in this is why we're all worried, I suspect, about the trans movement. I'm worried about women's rights, and I'm worried about children's bodies. And all the other stuff that comes with that, I'm not quite so worried about. But, you know, my focus, my absolute focus, which is clearly transphobic, is pro-women.
So, Kelly J. Keane's whole campaign is based on these two ostensible motivations: protecting children's bodies and protecting women's rights. By protecting children, she means from the supposed dangers of transgender ideology. If trans people are socially accepted, that might lead to more young people wanting to transition, and that might lead to them going on puberty blockers or undergoing surgeries. Keane talks repeatedly about the possible side effects of medical transition, as well as the minority of detransitioners, people who transition and then later detransition. Keane is particularly concerned about the possible effects of puberty blockers upon children's later fertility. That's just something to remember there. Additionally, Keane uses some very tortured logic to try to make connections between trans people and paedophilia in a manner that's very reminiscent of homophobic claims about gay people. By protecting women's rights, she primarily means by excluding trans people from what she considers to be women's spaces. Spaces like women's restrooms, changing rooms, sports teams, and the likes. Now, I acknowledge that Keane wouldn't accept me saying trans people here. She would say she's motivated by keeping men out of women's spaces, but as we'll see, she doesn't really mean men. She does mean trans people. And something else to remember here is that by protecting women's rights, she actually means just her personal interpretation of this one singular right, because as we'll also see, she's perfectly willing to give up other women's rights in pursuit of her single issue. She's less of a women's rights campaigner and more of a women's right campaigner. This single-issue approach to activism has divided the anti-trans crowd into two camps. As Keane moves from the outskirts to the mainstream of the anti-trans world, whether one is a supporter or critic of her style of activism has become the question to answer in the anti-trans community. The group opposed to Keane are the more liberal, academic anti-trans campaigners. These are self-styled, gender-critical radical feminists. They read theory, they author articles in broadsheet newspapers, they give talks at universities, publish books, and all that stuff. When it comes to pushing back against trans rights, this group plays a subtler game than Keane. This is the crowd who talk about just having a few concerns. They present themselves as the adults in the room. They're aware of the need for good optics. They want to be seen to have won the argument legitimately. They work very hard to convey that they're not motivated by bigotry, they're not motivated by transphobia, they just have a few concerns. As a political strategy, they will be accepting of a minority of trans people. They will often name and gender trans people correctly, for instance, but they'll draw a distinction between what they see as true trans people and confused bandwagon jumpers getting swept up in a trend. As such, they will promote the voices of transgender people like Debbie Hayton, who opposes gender self-identification. They can point to Hayton and say, see, even some trans people have valid concerns about trans rights. They use Hayton and people like her to attempt to divide trans people as a group between what they see as the true trans people and the fake trans people. They see having a few Debbie Haytons around as an acceptable trade-off for dividing their opposition and achieving their political goals. This group of campaigners cannot stand Kelly J. Keane. You see, Keane openly denies the existence of transness outright. There are no trans people in Keane's world. She doesn't believe in trans people or trans rights, which is probably why she's happy to be called transphobic. For Keane, all trans women are creepy men in dresses motivated by sick sexual perversions, and all trans men are self-hating, insane women who want to cut their breasts off because of internalized misogyny. That's it. Zero exceptions, including the likes of Debbie Hayton, who Keane has a particular animosity for. Keane repeatedly dead names and misgenders Hayton, like she does for all trans people she refers to, and she harshly criticizes anyone in the gender-critical crowd who's willing to tolerate being around someone who she endlessly and loudly proclaims to be a creepy pervert man occupying women-only spaces. Kelly J, I'm happy to be called the transphobe Keane, is a nightmare for the anti-trans campaigners who are concerned about optics. The fundamental divide here is that Keane takes a no such thing as bad publicity approach to activism. For her, the only problem is that not enough people have heard about all the evil trans people and all the terrible things they're doing. If more people knew what I knew, she thinks, they'd be rioting in the streets. The argument is already won. As far as Keane is concerned, it isn't even really an argument, so optics don't matter. All that matters is attention. Everyone knows trans people aren't real, Keane thinks, and the only reason you'd say different is if you're either insane, a lying pervert trying to sneak into a woman's locker room, or you're just too afraid to admit what you really think. She talks frequently about the silent majority who agree with her, and low turnout at her events never conveys that few people agree with her, of course, only that there's a fear of turning up. And in fact, the fewer people who turn up just goes to prove how frightened the silent majority must be of speaking up. However, the problem for Keane, and for the other anti-trans campaigners, whether they agree with her or not, is that she's wrong. Optics do matter. Not everyone already agrees with her. There isn't a silent majority just waiting for the opportunity to speak up. Not all attention is good attention here. Attention that comes at the expense of associating your movement with fascists and neo-Nazis is bad attention, because whatever concern might exist in the silent majority about things like puberty blockers or women's sports, they're also concerned about neo-Nazis. Opposition to trans rights might be a single issue for Kelly J. Keane, but despite what she thinks, it isn't for the vast majority of society. Another optics problem for the gender-critical feminist crowd is that Keane refuses to call herself a feminist. She takes a very personal and furious approach to responding to criticism coming from feminists, and herself is harshly critical of what she sees as feminism failing women. All those fancy academic feminists should have pushed back against trans rights harder and sooner, she says, and she carries an enormous grudge against them for being, as she sees it, asleep at their posts. So, Kelly J. Keane can't play nice with the other transphobes and keeps trashing their political strategies. And let's take a look at an example of this in action. So, in a video posted after the Melbourne rally, Keane attempts to sow doubt over the legitimacy of the neo-Nazi group who turned up to support her, suggesting it may have been a false flag operation.
And I just... Something about it, all of this doesn't make any sense. It feels really off. I don't think it's beyond the wit of anyone to think that that either was TRA dressed up, or police, or just... something was just awful.
Now I find this a particularly audacious claim because a couple of months before the rally, in January, Keane was actually told that far-right groups were going to turn up to her events, and it was recorded.
I don't think, I would be really shocked if we suddenly come to Australia and then a load of really vile, nefarious, racist people turn up and actually take the platform and the microphone. And if they do...
But they do turn up. That's the problem. They do turn up. They have been turning up to events in Australia.
Oh, what, and they make speeches?
No, but they turn up to the events. You know that, right? You were aware of that crowd.
People are free to turn up wherever they like. We're at Speaker's Corner, we have...
I'm just saying you're aware that they've been turning up to trans events in Australia, correct?
Let's say they take the microphone, which is unlikely because it's mostly women that speak, but even if they do, it's a free speech event. Everyone is free to turn their backs on them and say we disagree and shout, because that's the way...
Would you disagree with them, so you would disavow that speech?
I don't disavow anybody. I will disavow words if I disagree with them and I hear them, but I won't disavow someone's thoughts that they have in their head. No.
Well, these are the things that are my concern, because the community in Florida, I think when you were there, an ex-Proud Boy member that the locals knew didn't say anything. He just said, I don't like trans and kids. But the media there had a field day because they knew.
They didn't, though.
Him.
They didn't have a field day. It didn't make the news. It might have been in, like, lefty print media, but... So what? So a man that has potentially unpalatable views about something else spoke and said he doesn't like trans and kids. So what?
That's a group of Australian anti-trans radical feminist campaigners there, trying to convey to Keane in a Twitter space ahead of her Australia trip that far-right groups are going to turn up to her events. Their worry, which proved to be extremely prescient, is that if Keane lets a bunch of far-right fascists turn up to her events, people will afterwards associate gender-critical feminism with fascism. Associating with fascists hands free ammunition to their political opponents, who can now say, with evidence Keane provided to them, don't listen to that lot, they're friends with the neo-Nazis. And Keane's answer on receiving this warning is to say, so what if they turn up? It's a free speech event. She also brought this warning up in some of her January live streams, where she doubled down on her policy that anyone is encouraged to attend her events.
Now, let's go over this again. Every single woman, whatever her views, is welcome at a Let Women Speak event. Every single man, no matter what his views are welcome at a Let Women Speak event. We are allowing anyone to speak, anyone to attend. We don't disavow, we don't police, we don't verify people at our events. We absolutely know that some people come to the events that have thoughts in their heads that I don't agree with. Amazing. And do you know what? I'm such a big fat grown-up that I can put up with it. You may fear guilt by association. I don't.
This is why it's particularly cheeky of Keane to try and suggest the possibility of the fascist group being false flag actors in disguise, because she was told they were going to turn up beforehand, and she said, so what? Everyone's welcome to my events. In the wake of this event, and Keane's disastrous failed attempt to tour New Zealand, the group Feminist Left Australia put out an article analysing the effects of her trip, coming to the conclusion that her visit had set their struggle back substantially because gender-critical feminism in Australia is now associated with Nazism. And I quote, "It is quite simple. If KJK did not take a single-issue approach to her activism, focusing solely on transgenderism rather than on women's rights as a whole, and had not spent the past few years cozying up to the extreme right, the NSN would not have come to the rally. KJK thus bears much of the responsibility for the association of gender-critical feminism with Nazism in Australia due to her failure to distance herself from the NSN. So, good job to Kelly J there. Well done." Keane herself often takes a plausibly deniable approach to cozying up to the far right, a little bit like how Matt Walsh will openly call himself a fascist as a fake joke. You know, if you criticise me, well, I was just joking, you see, but if you happen to agree with me, well then I wasn't actually joking at all, I'm deadly serious. One of Keen's social media profile pictures is a Barbie in a Nazi uniform, for instance, and she's also fond of saying things like this.
Often I'm accused of being buddying up to certain far-right groups. Where are you, boys? Thought we were friends. Fascist is the new word for legend.
If Keen gets any pushback for flirting with fascism, she'll say, "Oh, don't take everything so seriously. I'm only joking, of course." But in addition to only joking, she does actually want very much for the other far-right groups to attend her events. One funny aspect to all this is that Keen is confused by the rejection of the more liberal academic radical feminists. She mistakenly believes that they don't like her because she is, as she claims, working class, which in her colloquial non-Marxist understanding of class is absolutely laughable as an aside, but it's actually because she's letting Nazis paint swastikas all over their political project. They put a lot of effort into their attempts to not be seen as transphobic, and then Keen turns up with her fascist friends and says, "No, we are transphobic, we are opposed to trans rights. I'm going to dead name and misgender every trans person I talk about, even trans people who are currently helping us, like Debbie Hayton. And if you've got a problem with that, I'm going to annihilate you." And then after all that, she...
Sack of meat apart from me, won't you? He hasn't accomplished nearly as much as you in your short time here.
kill yourself.
She's like, why don't they like me? It must be because I'm working class. It's amazing. So Keen's single-issue activism has something of a strategy problem for the more respectable transphobes. But there's another problem with her single-issue activism, and it's that her stated justifications for it don't actually make any sense. So one issue with Keen's activism is that her single-issue anti-trans approach to women's rights is causing her to ally herself and her cause with people who oppose abortion. She will support politicians based solely on their regressive stance on trans rights, even if they also support efforts to outlaw abortion, and those two things often come hand in hand, of course. For instance, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll know that she invited the anti-abortion politician Baroness Emma Nicholson to speak at one of her events, and also that she's a member of Hands Across the Aisle, an organisation founded by two anti-abortion activists. She's sung the praises of conservative politicians who oppose abortion, and she even supported Donald Trump in the last presidential election. Her Australian trip was in part funded by CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, a group whose chairman Matt Schlapp once stated that an abortion ban would be an answer to the racist Great Replacement myth. And Keen also has other ties to US anti-abortion activists, which we'll talk about in due time. Now, Keen's willingness to give up abortion rights is not left to the reader's imagination here. She is explicit about it, once stating outright that the right to illegal abortion would be, quote, worth setting aside. And on the day before the last US presidential election, Keen endorsed Donald Trump with the following justification.
If I'm gonna lay my cards on the table, I would like to wake up tomorrow without any change to the presidency. And I know I'm not supposed to say that, because that instantly makes me a white nationalist and a racist and a terrible person. But that's what I hope for. I think if it comes down to reproductive rights for women, or the right to say who we are and what we are, I think the latter is far more important. I think you can win reproduction rights back. I don't even know if there's a general appetite in America to take them away.
Now, it should be noted here that Keen also personally supports a particular restriction on abortion. She wants to scrap Gillick competence.
I've often talked about consent and how I'm very fearful about consent and how I think Gillick is the key to that, and it gets misused and appropriated in other areas of law, and I think that we really need to look back at that. Like, why are we enabling children to take sometimes contraceptives that are quite harmful, or access to abortion? I think that we really need to rethink all of this.
I think parents need to take back control of their children.
So, okay, Wikipedia description for people who don't know. Gillick competence is a term originating in England and Wales and is used in medical law to decide whether a child, a person under 16 years of age, is able to consent to their own medical treatment without the need for parental permission or knowledge. This particular case was about contraception, but of course has effects in other areas of health. Imagine, say, a 15-year-old who wants to get vaccinated against a deadly disease, but their parents think George Soros is putting demonic microchips in vaccines. Now, do we think that child should have the right to consent to their own healthcare without parental permission? I would say yes, definitely, but Kelly J. Keane says no, parents need to take back control of their children. This ends up being a restriction on particular abortions because minors wouldn't be able to get abortions without parental consent or permission. This would, in cases where anti-abortion parents refuse to give consent, either force minors to carry pregnancies to term or cause them to seek out unsafe abortions. Keane often states that she is pro-choice, and I think she probably legitimately believes that she is, but that's just inside her own head, of course. Outside of her own head, she is a single-issue campaigner, so what she personally thinks of abortion doesn't really matter. She's more than willing to sacrifice that right at the altar of her anti-trans campaign. So, there's a few things to say about this. The first is that the claim that Keane is a women's rights campaigner is not true. She is willing to trade away women's rights that they already have. And a lot of hay has been made about the fact that Keane claims to be fighting for women's rights, but is also willing to give up women's rights, because that's an obvious hypocrisy, right? Worth noting here, though, is that Keane's willingness to team up with anti-abortion activists and support anti-abortion politicians also conflicts with her positions on child safety, and her stated worries about the effects of medical transition on young people's health, because Keane is willing to work with anti-abortion extremists who oppose abortion even in cases of rape, or where there's a significant threat to the health of the pregnant person, or even in cases where the person seeking an abortion
Oh, a shame we can't entertain her.
on! Let's go, man! Oh. Oh, thank you for watching. Shout out to Queen Elizabeth. Shout out to Nuo. Shout out to Shenzi, bro. Shout out to Shenzi. Shout out to Dash. Shout out to everybody. Have a new year. Have a new year. It's not even a good one, just a new one. Bye.